Touchpoints at the St. Louis Art Museum. I'm Stephen Cohen, I'm associated with the Merriwitz Center, and it's our pleasure and our honor to be able to host this series. And I'm happy to share with you, those of you who've already received the Jewish Light electronically will have seen a wonderful article about this, about the Jewish art in the St. Louis Art Museum that was put together by the Jewish Light, and there will be a series of them. And the Jewish Light is joining us in co-sponsoring this series of presentations by Dale on Jewish touchpoints at the St. Louis Art Museum. We welcome Dale back. She's familiar to you all. I'm going to skip the formal introduction and just say to her that it's an honor and a privilege to have you with us. And thank you for putting this program together and for sharing it with the Merriwitz folk.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And actually, I'm very excited about this series. It's I learned a lot. I mean, so it's been a lot of fun to put it together. So I hope you all do enjoy it. I really wanted to call it Ahasuerus at the Easel, but my husband said, no, we shouldn't, he didn't like that one. So instead, we're going to call it Brushing Up on Jewish Art. So I want to thank you for joining us as we brush up on Jewish art and fill in the picture with works found in the permanent collection of the St. Louis Art Museum. So it sounds easy, but it really is a difficult topic. After all, the St. Louis Art Museum is not a Jewish museum. It's not a synagogue. It's not a JCCA. It's a secular art museum showcasing millennia of artistic production throughout the world. And yet, as we look closely, we can see that the museum contains many objects that are appropriate for our theme. I was actually surprised to find so many. In fact, there are more objects, as my grandmother used to say, than you can shake a stick at. So in order to spotlight as many as possible, this program will look at touch points of Jewish art in the St. Louis Art Museum in 4 parts. So first, a disclaimer. My familiarity and experience revolves around art. My knowledge about Judaism is about 100 miles wide and maybe an inch deep. So while I have a decent grasp of the matter, I'm not an authority, not a maven, not a specialist in Jewish ritual or history. So please feel free to add any comments or corrections that would add to our conversation. That being said, let's begin with part 1. Okay, what is Jewish art? Now, anything Jewish is said to be complicated, and the topic of Jewish art is certainly that. So if our goal is to look at Jewish art, what exactly are we looking for? The question we might ask is not so much, is there Jewish art, but rather, when is art considered Jewish? How do you define it? What makes a work of art Jewish? So let's try to answer that complicated question. What is Jewish art? First, the most obvious definition would be Judaica, or Jewish ceremonial objects. These objects, like Torah covers, yads, talit, candlesticks, and menorahs, are used in rituals on Shabbat and holidays, in temples and synagogues, and in our homes every day. By the way, you might not know this, but SLAM has a special fund directed exclusively for the purchase of these scarce Judaica objects. It's called the Deanne and Paul Schatz Endowment Fund, and it gives the museum the opportunity to sort of compete for rare and irreplaceable Jewish treasures. And through the generosity of the Schatz Fund, we have purchased 2 objects that we will talk about in a few minutes. Second, the subject of the art might be derived from the Old Testament or the Bible. Perhaps made by a Jewish artist, perhaps not. Many works with Old Testament stories abound from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and we'll explore some of those today. And here's another way to look at it. The art could be based on a time and place important in Jewish history. I think we'll reference works of art from Assyria or Persia or Egypt made during the time of Moses or the Maccabees or Esther. And in our more modern world, we'll focus on Germany and the art that relates to the German Jewish kind of dark past. We can also look at art that depicts Jewish subjects or Jewish subject matter as another interpretation. Now, our museum doesn't include a large number of these objects, but those that it does feature are really remarkable. And we can also, I think another interpretation might be based on the fact that an art museum is only as good as the art it houses. And in many cases, a large number of our masterworks were donated by Jewish patrons. The St. Louis Art Museum wouldn't be in the top 10 in the country without gifts of these Jewish donors. With this in mind, I thought it would be really interesting to look at some of SLAM's Jewish supporters and the absolutely incredible objects that they contributed. And finally, we would describe, I think most obviously, Jewish art is art created by artists whose religion was Jewish. In the last 50 years, Jews have become quite prominent in painting and sculpture. And I think if Jews produce art, then it would be logical to label it Jewish art. So now that we have a working definition, but before we zoom in on Jewish art in the St. Louis Art Museum, let's address the tradition of Jewish art, because clearly no one definition of Jewish art can suffice. Each definition varies in focus, but there is commonality. They're all exquisitely produced works by master artists, and in some way are all an expression of Jewish experience, history, or culture. Okay, let's see if this works. Something is a little off on my, is that better? Does that work better? Okay. There was a time not long ago, less than a century, that most Jews believed that there was no such thing as Jewish art. And the reasoning was that the second commandment, you shall not make any graven image, precluded any kind of figurative representation. Scholars maintain that the prohibition against figurative images by the rabbis of the Talmud was actually taken seriously by the ancients. And as a result, Jewish art did not exist. Yet Jews in all parts of the world have always valued the visual arts. And you can see that in this selection of art on this slide. These are not objects from Slam, but representatives of Judaica from different centuries, different cultures, and different parts of the world. Judaism may never have developed an impressive artistic tradition akin to that of Catholicism, but Jews have been creating pieces of both decorative and ceremonial art for centuries. When many people think of the arts as connected to Judaism, they may first think of the literary arts, and rightly so. Known as the people of the book, part of Judaism's great contribution to humanity has been in its texts. The Torah has been perfectly reproduced for hundreds of generations. And if even one letter of the Torah is wrong, the entire scroll is invalidated. The attention to the origin and quality of the Torah parchment, as well as the type of quill and ink, suggests enormous reverence for beauty as well as for religious content. And there is nothing in Jewish law that prevents creativity. In fact, the concept of, quote, making a mitzvah or commandment beautiful, unquote, has led to a rich heritage of Jewish ceremonial art. The injunction to beautify each commandment to the best of one's ability includes everything from selecting the most beautiful citron fruit on Sukkot to composing the most beautiful melodies for prayers. So in reality, the lives of most Jews throughout history have been full of visual art, jam-packed with irresistible stories. So let's begin with Jewish ritual and ceremonial objects, or Judaica. The word Judaica actually describes objects used in the home or in the synagogue across history and geography, made of all types of materials: silver Torah finials, glass Kiddush cups, brass Hanukkah menorahs, marriage contracts on parchment. These are only some of the diverse works under the wide umbrella of Judaica. Although Jews did not embrace the high art tradition of Western Europe until the modern period, Jewish communities created art that suited their needs. Jews were often barred from the medieval craftsmen's guilds, and they lacked the cathedrals and the royal courts that stimulated the creation of so many of the greatest masterpieces in Western art history. Instead, Jewish life was surrounded by a different, yet still rich visual culture. The St. Louis Art Museum only features 2 works that fit this definition of Judaica. Normally, these objects live in a temple or a synagogue or a Jewish museum. So we're fortunate to be able to share these beautiful pieces of Judaica with you all. Both of the objects were gifts from the Deanne and Paul Schatz Endowment Fund that I referred to earlier. Now, some of you may have been on a Zoom call earlier this month where these next 2 objects were featured, but they were so significant that I wanted to make sure that those of you who weren't able to catch the presentation are able to enjoy these exquisite works. So please excuse any repetition and just enjoy them again. The Torah ark is always the center of attention in the synagogue and has been throughout history treated in interesting and striking ways. This rare Torah ark curtain was made by Jewish Italian artist Simcha Viterbo in the 18th century and is a new and exciting addition to Slam's permanent collection. Artist Simcha Viterbo embroidered this lavish sacred textile when she was only 15 years old. Viterbo was continuing in a long tradition of Italian Jewish women who created sumptuous textiles for their synagogues. Viterbo's father was a rabbi, and her family was fairly wealthy and prominent in Italy, known for importing wool. Her husband and son were both rabbis as well. Viterbo was known for her embroidery. Although she only lived to 40 years old, these synagogue textiles were made when she was still a teenager. So she likely created many more in her lifetime. Viterbo created an object that reflected not only her Jewish heritage, but also her own place and time. The year was 1755, and Viterbo was living in the Italian port city of Ancona on the Adriatic coast. In the 18th century, Ancona was a bustling port, a major trading crossroads, home to a lot of different communities and different ethnicities. It included a prosperous community of Jewish traders. According to early Christian legends, the first bishop of Ancona was no less than the great rabbi of Jerusalem, who took the Christian name of Quincus after baptism. It was also a papal state that since 1555 systematically had oppressed the Jewish residents, most of whom were forced into a few low-skilled jobs, compelled to wear Jewish markers, restricted to trade in secondhand clothing, and were not allowed to own property. The Jews were isolated in ghettos. 70% of the ghetto economy was devoted to the textile industry, creating, embellishing, and repairing all types of textiles, even secular pieces outside the ghetto. It was really the engine of the ghetto, and Jewish women fueled this engine and worked for years to earn money for their own dowries. This is a tour de force. It demonstrates a dizzying variety of embroidery and applique techniques and materials. It was made in a 3-dimension low relief quality using silver, pearl, wire, and metal, along with yarn and silk. And you can see the blow up here. Most textiles used in the ghetto were repurposed, coming from clothing, but this curtain shows no sign of reuse. The embroidery stitches are so tiny that it almost looks like a painting. I can't imagine how long it must have taken her to make this curtain, and nor can I imagine the patience necessary to do so. The Torah curtain is new for us, but old for the world. It is remarkable. In synagogues, the Torah scroll is often decorated with silver finials called rimonim. They were among the most elaborate objects commissioned for Torahs by wealthy Jewish patrons. Breastplates, pointers, and crowns also adorned the scrolls when they were not in use. The finials evolved from knobs at the upper end of the posts of the Torah scroll, where it's wound. The Hebrew name rimonim means pomegranate, because of the round shape recalling the biblical symbolic fruit. The many seeds of the pomegranate symbolize our 613 mitzvot, and the abundance of the seeds in the pomegranate also suggests fertility. Now, the finial bells would have signaled the Torah's approach as the procession made its way through the synagogue. The bells are associated with Aaron, the first high priest of Judaism, who had bells on the hemline of his robes. The bells signaled to everyone, pay attention. Pay attention. Don't be caught off guard. Protect yourself. Be vigilant. Of course, today, there are no jingly bells to wake us up. We're kind of more likely to respond to the chime of our iPhones. However, these bells were meant to wake us up, to notice what is around us, not just what we already see, but what is actually there. They challenge us to be curious, to be open, to explore, to learn. The bells remind us to stay alert, not just to threats like anti-Semitism, but also to opportunities. What a much needed reminder in today's world. So I hope you'll be able to visit these two objects in this special exhibition in the textile galleries in the lower level of the museum. They're featured with other textiles and handwork that help to place them in a particular place and time in their history. And their riches keep unfolding. It's a beautiful exhibition, and I know you'll enjoy it. The exhibition is on view until October 3rd. In addition to ceremonial objects, the St. Louis Art Museum has many works that reference Old Testament stories. These Bible stories have been the subject of scores of art through the centuries and across cultures. Here are a selected few from SLAM's permanent collection. First, a little Bible humor to lead us into our next section. I'm calling it Genesis, the first of a 5-part series. I thought that was appropriate considering the binge watching we're doing these days on television. So here's a story of a fan favorite from the Apocrypha, Judith and Holofernes, painted by Giorgio Vasari in 1554. Judith is the hero of the story as she came to the rescue when the Assyrian army led by General Holofernes, right here, who kind of looks like an Italian, like an ancient antique sculpture, laid siege to her city of Bethulia. He had cut off their water supply, and after 34 days of siege, Judith charmed the general with her beauty. Boldly infiltrating the Assyrian camp, brave and beautiful Judith dined with Holofernes, seduced him, and once he was drunk, she beheaded him with the help of her maid. Judith put the head on a spike, held it up to show the opposing army, and they fled in fright. They were chased past Damascus, liberating all of Israel. The story has been a favorite story of feminists for centuries. Vasari the painter used a pose copied from Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, as you see on the right. You can see this pose is almost an exact replica. Judith is shown as a physically powerful woman, a visible indication of her inner courage. Several years ago, a 10-year-old boy on one of my tours passed, we were talking about this painting, and he said, "Wow, she has arms like Mark McGuire," which I thought was wonderful. Giorgio Vasari was one of the foremost artists of the 16th century. He was renowned as a painter, draftsman, architect, and author, a true Renaissance man. in the Renaissance. Vasari wrote Lives of the Artists, a series of biographies that's filled with gossip about the lives of Renaissance artists. And you can still order it on Amazon. Here's a copy of a cover of the first volume. Lots of dirt, lots of rumors and stories. It's a fun read. Giorgio Vasari invented the field of art history. He coined the term rebirth or Renaissance to describe the history of Italian art from the 13th century onward. In short, Giorgio Vasari branded the Renaissance, giving it the image we associate with it today. Though he was not Michelangelo, who was, he was a marketing genius, and he and his army of assistants could and did complete objects on a grand scale. Vasari worked for the mighty Medici clan. This painting is an homage or tribute to Cosimo de' Medici. Judith's jewels are taken from this collection of antique jewelry that Cosimo prized, and you can see them more clearly in the blow-up, or a little more clearly anyway. Giorgio Vasari was the man most responsible for promoting the Medici family as patrons of the arts, and they in turn promoted him. This painting holds its own with the best of the Renaissance, and the story, as my pun-loving husband would say, is ahead of its time. In Genesis 18, 1-16, 3 men appeared to Abraham as he was seated in the heat of the day in the door of the tent. Abraham, obeying the code of hospitality to travelers, offered them water to wash and bread and meat for refreshment. The leader prophesied that Abraham and his aged wife Sarah would have a son. Sarah from the door of the tent laughed at the absurdity. As the story continues, Sarah, childless and assuming she was too old to bear a child, suggested Abraham sleep with Hagar, a maidservant. As you know, Hagar bore Ishmael, and after the prophecy was fulfilled and Isaac was born to Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael were sent to the desert. So here we have artistic invention. The angels are visitors. The tent is a masonry dwelling, and this hardly looks like a desert. At the same time, there's an attention to detail that's characteristic of Ferrari, the painter. On the bottom of the painting is a still life right here, with a beautifully rendered water jug and cloth to wash the feet of the visitors. He brought the elaborate religious subject down to earth in a theatrical stage-like setting. It's meticulous and elegant. The open hand of the angel focuses on Abraham's deference to his guests, and the small figure of Hagar and Ishmael make clear the prophecy of Sarah's child and the primacy of Isaac. Here you can see Hagar and Ishmael, just a little itty bitty right there. Ferrari was known for his unsentimental and unpretentious religious subjects like this one. Benjamin West is called by many the father of American painting. He was the most influential 18th century artist and became the foremost history painter in England. He received commissions from King George and other English patrons, and he made tons of money. At the same time, West served as teacher and advisor to 3 generations of American artists in London. He was called the American Raphael, and surprisingly, or amusingly, he named his first child Raphael. Slam purchased this painting about 2 years ago, and what a great addition to our colonial American collection. It's huge. It's about 5 feet by 7 feet, and it tells the story of Belshazzar, a 6th century BC Babylonian ruler, seen reclining in teal and gold on the right. There's Belshazzar. The temple in Jerusalem had been looted, and the Babylonians were out of control, drinking out of holy vessels at a banquet in an act of sacrilege. Mysterious handwriting appears on the wall. Here you see the handwriting. Belshazzar's advisors try to understand the handwriting, but to no avail. So Belshazzar asked the prophet Daniel to interpret it. And Daniel had been captured by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylonia and held at court as a prophet who could talk to God. Daniel gestures to the glowing inscription and explains that the inscription foretold the fall of Belshazzar's empire, because Belshazzar has not given honor to God. Within hours, Belshazzar was dead. Divine retribution was swift. What's interesting here is that this grand narrative is an allegory, a moral and yet very political message. The year was 1775, and West lived in England and relied on the favor of George III. As an American at the pinnacle of the British art world, West found himself in a kind of precarious position. He didn't want American independence. This, then, is a veiled warning to the king to compromise with the citizens of America. Read the writing on the wall and just get along, he said. West supported conciliation. He claimed that there would be an ominous note if King George, like Belshazzar, didn't change. This is where his head was in 1775, trying to straddle both worlds and still maintain his position with the king. It may have been a quiet message to George III to get his act together. Of course, the king never did aim for a peaceful way to make nice with those angry American colonists. West didn't avoid politics, but he was careful with the relationship between America and England. In reality, the artist's subject is biblical, but with strong undertones. This detailed textile depicts the biblical story of Purim in Queen Esther, seen kneeling at center right. King Ahasuerus of Persia, Esther's husband, agrees to Esther's request to save her people and reverse the chief minister Haman's plot to kill the Jews. Mordecai, her uncle, is seen standing beside the throne, and Haman is seen on horseback being banished from the court. You can see him right here. In this scene, the central characters are dressed in court attire of 17th century England. This was pretty much the custom, to dress historical characters in contemporary clothing. I suppose it made it more accessible to the public. They could relate more easily then to the story. At any rate, around this time, a distinctive style of figurative embroidery like this one emerged in England. Glass beads and pearls and metal threads add to the opulence of these pieces. This fine example features a unique form of three-dimensional embroidery called stump work. This was accomplished with raised metal threads, much like the Torah curtain that we just saw. These images depicted were often based on illustrated texts and engravings and were mainly embroidered by girls and women. Needlework was a popular vehicle for portraying traits associated with the ideal woman, who was brave and pious and obedient. The biblical Queen Esther was seen as embodying these virtues. Since the Middle Ages, the city of Limoges in central France thrived on the production of enamel on metal. Now, we think of Limoges today, and we mainly think about porcelain. Yet it was enameling that was actually their claim to fame. Their enamels are generally considered the finest produced in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Now, what is enameling? Well, enameling is a type of surface decoration made by firing and fusing powdered glass to basically metal, usually copper. The powder melts, flows, and then hardens to a smooth, durable, lustrous coating. Now, unlike oil painting, enameled metal retains its hue without fading. The St. Louis Art Museum has a strong selection of enamel works in our permanent collection, many with Old Testament stories. These are two prime examples. The first depicts the story of Joseph, who interpreted Pharaoh's dream to mean that there would be 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. That's in Genesis 41. The plaque on the right was originally part of a box. According to Genesis chapter 14, after enemy raids on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abram led 318 soldiers to rescue captives and recover their belongings. Here, the king offers the soldiers bread and wine upon their victorious returns. When viewing these enamels in person, you'll be able to better experience the luster and the deep color and the detail of these biblical stories. These slides just really do not do them justice at all. Tazza is the Italian word for an ornamental cup that has a wide, shallow bowl and rests on a stem foot. It's based on an antique prototype and was reintroduced in the Renaissance. Often tazzas were used for serving wine or sweetmeats, and it too was enameled, made by the master craftsman in Limoges in the 16th century. This tazza illustrates two Old Testament scenes. Inside the dish, Jethro observes his son-in-law Moses listening to the Israelites' problems. And on his father-in-law's advice, Moses chooses capable men from all over Israel and made them leaders and judges for the people. On the lid, Absalom slays the servants of his father David. This piece was probably intended as a showpiece because of its highly intricate and decorative character. During the Renaissance, people traveled with chests such as these to keep their valuables safe. It's called a Cassone Chest, and they were used to store articles like clothing and special books, as well as jewels and valuables. Now, this was really clever. The lids of these chests were flat, as you can see here, to enable the owner to sleep on top of his goods in order to keep them safe. Sort of like an early portable safe deposit box, I guess. The Cassone was also one of the trophy furnishings of rich merchants and aristocrats in Italian culture, probably from the late Middle Ages onward. Its sense of luxury helped define status and wealth and often served as a wedding chest in important marriage alliances between two important families. These chests were often carved with biblical scenes. Ours deals with the life of Joseph. Why Joseph? I really don't know, but I can guess that likely someone in the family was named Joseph. This tapestry is a rare masterpiece because textiles like this one are so fragile, many have unfortunately perished. So it's unusual to have one of this quality and complexity. Tapestry is a type of very, very tight weave, and among the finest ever done were those in the Middle Ages and Renaissance in Europe. They served a double function, one as an educational tool telling a story, and two is insulation for the cold walls in the castles and palaces. Tapestries were worked only small sections at a time. They were too big to work all at once. So a worker began with a detailed plan called a cartoon. This was outlined with colored chalk to form a network of dots to serve as a template or guide that was transferred onto the tapestry, to the back of the tapestry. Wool in combination with silk or silver and gold threads was the most common material used. Ours is medieval style done by a master weaver. This is characteristic of the style, with close figures in intricate Gothic and Renaissance costumes. The 36 figures in our tapestry depict the story of David and Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan. In the center and lower section, the prophet Nathan is rebuking David and Bathsheba for their deeds. Here you can see Nathan, and here's David and Bathsheba here. Nathan's outstretched arm creates a dramatic link between him and David. The tapestry is a showpiece. It is the best that can be accomplished by the most skillful weavers in the golden age of tapestry. Seated beneath an archway similar to canopies that covered the altar, this figure probably represents Malaleel, a descendant from Adam and Eve's third son, Seth. The window was once part of a series of Jesus's ancestors that adorned the upper walls of an abbey in France. The inclusion of Old Testament ancestors visually reinforced the idea that the New Testament fulfilled the promise of the Old. Near the end of the 12th century, progress in architectural knowledge made it possible to construct very, very tall buildings of stone leading to the spread of the Gothic cathedral. And the decoration of these cathedrals, such as stained glass, attempted to reproduce the kingdom of heaven on earth and to put the devout worshiper in visual contact with the holy persons and the splendors that they would encounter during eternal life. The medieval stained glass windows were composed of colored glass, and the pieces were joined together with lead. When sunlight penetrates the window during the day, a person inside the building sees intense colors like precious stones. Stained glass windows such as these were intended to educate the worshiper about their religion. These churches were thus known as books of stone. When we think of Chagall, we visualize his fanciful images of blue cows and flying lovers and biblical prophets and green-faced fiddlers on the roof. Just talking about them makes you smile. Throughout his 75-year career, during which he produced an astounding 10,000 works. Amazing. His pictorial universe set him apart from much of 20th century art, which was focusing on abstraction. Chagall's work was typically infused with a nostalgia for his life in Russia. However, he was also drawn to painting Jewish themes in his work. Some call it a kind of Jewish magical realism. While his paintings are filled with fantastical and magical worlds, his art was sparked by his Jewish identity. Chagall said, "If I were not a Jew, I would not have been an artist." Many of Chagall's paintings are inspired by themes from the Bible, such as this biblical narrative, temptation. So, which do you think is Adam and which is Eve, the yellow or the green figures? It's very hard to tell, but the yellow one is Adam, and you can see that with his ribs right here. Chagall treated this traditional subject in a Cubist style, which he encountered after moving to Paris in 1910. This was only one of a few paintings in which he used this style. Forms are broken down into faceted planes. The Cubist device of the split face allows Eve to look at both the apple and its destination. And here we see the two faces of Eve. The son of an Orthodox Jewish laborer and shopkeeper, Chagall was born in Vitebsk in an unforgiving part of Russia called the Pale of Settlement, a land now distributed between countries including Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. Chagall found his subjects all around him. He would paint Hasidim studying, visiting rabbis, animals that were wander into his garden, his granddad, a butcher, farmers taking their cattle to market. In other words, shuttle life. What Chagall was depicting would disappear in his lifetime. In 1944, when Vitebsk was liberated from the Nazis, the population of 170,000 Jews had been almost completely wiped out. Chagall had a temperamental and melodramatic and passionate character. If he was unhappy with the painting, he would just hurl it out the window. At the same time, he had a business-like side to him, and he even sold the doodles that he made on cafe napkins. He didn't exchange pictures with other artists, he said, because he liked his own too much. The Bolshevik authorities frowned upon Chagall's style of art as too modern, so Chagall became part of the avant-garde group of artists working in Paris. He would not set foot in Russia again for 51 years. In 1940, German tanks rolled into France. Chagall didn't want to recognize the Nazi danger, secure in his belief that no one would touch the great Chagall. Mark and his wife, Bella, waited too long to escape the Nazis. After the harrowing experiences of being arrested by the Nazis and finally rescued by the Americans, they boarded a ship for New York in 1941. After Bella, the love of his life, died in 1944, Chagall remarried a woman much younger who helped catapult him to global celebrity and vast wealth. He worked every day of his life to the age of 97 when he died of a heart attack. Some have called him the 20th century's greatest Jewish painter. Amazingly, we have 15,000 works on paper in the St. Louis Art Museum, many of them prints that feature biblical stories like these. So let's take a minute and talk about printmaking, because these works are fragile and light sensitive. We rarely see them in person. They live in a dark drawer in the print study room and only see the light of day every decade or so. So this is a good opportunity to talk about a few of them. In an environment permeated by almost infinitely multiplied images in newspapers and magazines, on billboards and computer screens, it's hard to imagine a world in which every image was unique. Yet prior to the 15th century, images were not only one of a kind, but rare, generally found locked away in palaces to which few had access or affixed to the wall of a church. The technology of printmaking, which first fell into place around 1400, suddenly made it possible for hundreds or even thousands of essentially identical images to be produced from a single block of carved wood or a plate of metal. The initial demand driving the early print market was, interestingly, the desire for playing cards and also inexpensive religious stories such as these. Prints proved a means of mass producing these objects that brought them within the reach of even the poorest members of society. Almost every household had at least one print. So let's look at a few of my favorites. There are a few artists more universally known than Rembrandt. The St. Louis Art Museum is home to 35 works of art from the Dutch master, including these two. Rembrandt lived and worked in Amsterdam during the so-called Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century. Although most residents in Amsterdam during Rembrandt's lifetime practiced Dutch Calvinism, the city was renowned for its welcoming spirit toward immigrants, especially the Sephardic Jews who'd been expelled from Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition. Jews began settling in the Netherlands after 1600s. They found a general welcome because of the city's official policy of toleration. In 1642, after Rembrandt's wife died, he rarely painted the formal bread and butter portraits of the Dutch rich and famous that had made his reputation. His focus was now on Old and New Testament stories. Rembrandt tried to recreate these Bible stories as they were, in a sympathetic and above all human manner. Jews looked Jewish. According to the Jewish History Museum in Amsterdam, there's a story that Rembrandt went to visit a synagogue, and that in the synagogue, he saw such interesting faces and presumed to have thought that this was how Jesus must have looked. And that is why his biblical characters have dark hair and are dark-haired and dark-eyed. This, however, was not the taste of Holland at the time. And so by 1656, Rembrandt was penniless and moved to the poorer district of the city. Living in the Jewish quarter in Amsterdam, he created his greatest series of images, his biblical oil paintings and prints. Rembrandt never formally joined any church, but he was an astute student of the Bible. At times, he turned to Jewish theologians for insight into the depictions of Old Testament imagery. He also hired models from the Jewish community and received commissions from Jewish patrons. In his print on the left, Rembrandt presents God, the bearded gesturing figure at the left, when he tells Abraham that his elderly wife Sarah shall have a son. Rembrandt's masterful technique enhances the narrative. It's a very different interpretation, a more humanistic interpretation of the story than that painted by Ferrari that we saw a few slides ago. The subject of the print on the right looks deceptively simple. A man in a nightshirt kneels in prayer by his bed. The harp, however, identifies him as King David, the singer and writer of the Psalms. Here, David confesses his adultery with Bathsheba. I am weary of my mourning, he said. Every night I flood my bed with tears. Rembrandt's legacy as an etcher is characterized by the new and innovative techniques that he introduced to printmaking. Rembrandt added emotional and psychological depth to his subjects through expressive faces, dramatic body language, and his bold use of shadow and light. He made close to 350 etchings during his lifetime. He was so imaginative and skillful that even scratches and accidents with the acid wash would be used to his advantage. Rembrandt's work seems to transcend time. His etchings are truly masterful. William Blake occupies a unique place in the history of Western art. He was a poet of exceptional genius, as well as an accomplished artist. In his lifetime, he was best known as an engraver. Now, he's also recognized for his innovative poetry, printmaking, and painting. The illustrations for the Book of Job are among Blake's most important achievements as a printmaker. The engraved title and 21 plates were designed and printed by Blake himself. Throughout his life, Blake was obsessed with the story of Job. For over 40 years, Blake made preliminary studies, outlines, and preparatory sketches for this project. In this print, Blake depicts the confrontation between God and man. The Lord appears in a swirling vortex. Job appears like an Old Testament prophet, wise and in great awe. Blake saw Job's trials and eventual spiritual rebirth as parallel to the creative struggles of the artist. He apparently identified with Job, as he spent his lifetime unrecognized and impoverished. Not until the late 19th century were his achievements recognized. Albrecht Dürer is widely hailed as one of the greatest German artists. He came from a family of artists and was an accomplished printmaker, draftsman, painter, and theorist of the Renaissance age. Dürer is perhaps best known for revolutionizing the field of printmaking, elevating the medium to an independent art form. The print could now sit side by side with painting. Dürer became a leader of the Northern Renaissance, incorporating the new scientific approach to perspective in human anatomy into his work. Dürer served as the official court artist to two Holy Roman emperors and created portraits of luminaries. By 1504, Dürer was a master of engraving, and this rich, dense image of the first man and woman renders snakeskin, animal fur, tree bark, and leaves in great detail. It also manifests Dürer's fascination with the ideal form. The figures are nearly symmetrical, and that of Adam is reminiscent of a Greek god. The engraving is meant to show Adam and Eve as physically perfect. For Dürer, who mostly depicted Christian subjects, the creation of theoretically perfect human bodies was a pathway to comprehending the divine. He thus represented Adam and Eve as he understood them in both theological and artistic terms. Moments before tasting the forbidden fruit, they are still uncorrupted, existing in a state of faultless beauty. You know, there's something about being so close to these old master prints. They reveal the artist's hand, and they offer an intimacy and an immediacy that you can't get in a painting. So I hope you will make an appointment with the Print and Drawing Study Room to see these and many more Old Testament prints in person. We can't do them justice here, and I promise you they will not disappoint. So now let's turn to our next definition of Jewish art. These last three objects are works that feature Jewish subjects, all painted by the best portrait artists of their time. The first is a portrait of John Julius Angerstein, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1765. Joshua Reynolds was the most prominent artist in 18th century England, and he set the standard for 18th century portraiture. Founder of the Royal Academy in 1769, he was an innovator who rose above the status of what he called mere face painting. He was incredibly successful. Painter to the rich and famous, ladies were depicted wearing those large feathery hats and fashionable dresses that kind of looked like nightgowns. By the 1700s, Reynolds had over 150 sitters per year, a huge studio with over 200 assistants, and earned the enormous sum of £6,000 per year. His assistants could paint the bodies and backgrounds, and he would paint the face. Occasionally, he would paint the whole portrait, depending on the importance of the sitter, and would charge accordingly. So who's the subject of this painting, and why are we talking about it? Well, the financier and philanthropist, John Julius Angerstein, was born in St. Petersburg in 1735 to a German Jewish family who had settled in Russia. He emigrated to England in 1749. Now, there are rumors concerning his possible illustrious and royal origins, about his possibly being the illegitimate son of Catherine the Great. It's probably not true, but it makes a good story. At any rate, Angerstein developed the insurance firm that eventually became Lloyd's of London. And he counted King George III and the British Prime Minister among his friends. Angerstein was said to own a third share in the slave estates in Grenada, using profits from the slave trade to build up his world-class art collection. Although a slave owner, he was also on the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor, an organization with strong abolitionist connections. Angerstein became incredibly successful and an astute connoisseur of art. His collection of 38 paintings from Da Vinci to Rembrandt to Vermeer and Turner became the nucleus of the celebrated National Gallery of London. Mendes Cohen might be the most intriguing historical figure you've never heard of. Mendes Cohen was part Forrest Gump and part Indiana Jones. During the War of 1812, when the bombs were bursting in air, he helped defend Baltimore's Fort McHenry from the British fleet. He was at the Supreme Court when states' rights were at stake. He was at Annapolis when arguments raged over fugitive slaves. He attended the coronations and funerals of British monarchs. He had a front row seat during the Paris revolts in 1830 and the ascent of Louis Philippe to the throne after that. He bowed before a pope and hung out with the Rothschilds in London. He was in Jerusalem as the first American tourist, visited the Middle East when few Americans had, and returned with enough Egyptian artifacts to fill a museum, which they later did. And that was just the first half of his life. He was a philanthropist, an American patriot, a member of the elite, and a proud Jew. He was thoroughly devoted to Judaism, living a conscientious and observant Jewish life. Cohen was a member of the prominent Jewish family that lobbied for some of the earliest rights for Jews in America, including the right to hold state office. No man was better known in Baltimore, more admired for his generosity and deep respect and adherence to Judaism. After years of managing his family's banking house in New York City, he retired at the age of 33 and became a globetrotter. And that's when things get interesting. Cohen decided to see the world. On one of his most notable trips in 1832, he traveled up the Nile in a boat flying an American flag for protection. It was said that the flag was made up from bits of his wife's petticoat, his own red undershirt, and white stars cut out of his wife's gloves. He collected 689 Egyptian antiquities and later gave his collection to Johns Hopkins University, the first such collection to be acquired by an American. Upon his return to the States 6 years later, Cohen served as Maryland House of Delegates on the board of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was an aide to the Maryland governor and traveled back to London for Queen Victoria's coronation. He died in 1879 at age 83, still regaling strangers with stories of his adventures. The painter of this portrait, Rembrandt Peale, was one of the most sought-after artists of his day. His siblings, Titian Peale and Raphael Peale, were all named after artists. It was the most remarkable family in American art history. Rembrandt Peale was second to none. He painted portraits of the colonial upper class, and his portrait of George Washington is said to be a perfect likeness. Colonel Mendes Cohen was 42 when this portrait was done. It hung in the Cohen family dining room from the time it was painted until 1929, when it was purchased by the St. Louis Art Museum. Our final piece today is a portrait of an old Jew by Antoine Pesny, whose flattering portrait defined 18th century Prussian aristocracy. He was a court painter to Frederick I of Prussia. His style was revered for his soft touch and muted palette, such as in this painting. It achieves an almost impressionistic effect through coloring and brushwork. He also produced a number of ambitious, large-scale ceiling paintings, as well as a series on dancers and actresses who performed in the Berlin Opera. Our painting of an old Jew has a spiritual, sensitive character. Here, dramatic lighting underscores the old Jew's humanity. Pesny's mastery of light and texture emphasize emotional depth and portray deep human feelings. Pesny believed that human emotions were more important than any other aspect of life, and his subjects' feelings and experiences are what he wanted to convey. The old Jew seems to be emerging from the background. There's a sort of Rembrandtish quality to the old man, and I would love to ask him what he was thinking. Well, as you have seen today with just these few images, the works in the St. Louis Art Museum are proof that a look into Jewish art can lead to some of the most intriguing works in our collection. I hope you've enjoyed them. So thank you all for joining us today to celebrate our first foray into Jewish art. Keep safe and healthy, and stay tuned for part 2 and more Jewish touch points for the St. Louis Art Museum. So do we have any questions or comments? Should I, well, it looks like we have some things in the chat. Should I stop sharing, Judith?
Yeah.
And we'll go to questions?
Yeah, sounds great.
What do you think?
Absolutely.
Stephen or
Yes,
Judith?
please, let's go to the questions if there are any.
Okay. Should I stop sharing to do that?
Yeah, that would be great.
You can.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear
Well,
me
we
now?
have you. Hi,
Can you hear?
Stephen. Okay, we have everybody, but okay. So I guess
We do have a few chat. We have a couple of comments and a couple of questions.
okay.
Rabbi Stiffman said, "Love the lecture." The donor pronounced her name Dean and not Deanne.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and in Maryland,
I thought it was going to be a biblical pronunciation that was wrong. Okay.
Marilyn has said this piece was recently on one of the daily art museum emails to members. I'm not sure which one that was. Marilyn, if you wanted to point that
I think
out,
it
you're
was
welcome to.
the reading of the writing on the wall.
Yes,
That was on there.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
It was just outstanding reading that description and the daily emails that the members are getting. It's been fabulous. It's been our visit to the museum on a daily basis.
oh, that's
Oh.
great. That's great. It gives you something to look for when you get there.
And Marilyn and I discuss it, and we have different opinions, and it's fascinating when we agree or when we see things that each other didn't see. It's been a wonderful experience.
Oh, that's great.
And I hope the museum continues from now on.
Well, they have, 30,000 pieces, so,
Yeah.
I think they should.
Now, I did have another question. You mentioned the print room, and I've never been in it. And is this an area where we can see all these prints that are in storage that nobody ever sees, or are there books of them? How does that work? And does one need to reserve a time to go into the print room?
Well, that's a good question. Yes. The print, it's on, I think the fourth floor, or third floor. I think and you have to get there this convoluted way, but the guards can tell you how to get there. And it's it stores all of our prints and drawings and photographs, and but they're all in these drawers. So what you need to do is to make an appointment to go to the prints and drawing study room. And if you have specific pieces that you want to see or a specific theme, they will pull those out and have them ready for when you come. So for
Okay,
example, if you want anything by Rembrandt, they'll pull out, maybe, 20 Rembrandt pieces. Or if you want to see, Old Testament prints, they'll pull out a number of those for you to see. You just have to tell them ahead of time what it is that you're interested in, because there are 15,000 pieces. So it's kind of hard to, but
so I belong to a group. Yeah, I belong to a group who would be interested in this. So we could select a date for like a field trip for my group, call the museum, reserve a time slot, and tell them we would like prints of Judaica, or, similar to what you were showing today. And they would be able to pull Judaica prints.
No, probably not that. I think you would have to give, if that's what you want to see, if you want to see Old Testament stories, they probably could do that. They don't have a list of the things that I gave you today, for example. And in the prints and drawings study room, they would know about which ones were Old Testament prints. So they
Thank
could
you.
do that. They could easily do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun. By the way, they can, I think there's only 18 people that they can take at a time in there. So I hope if your group
Yeah,
is big
that would work for my group. That would work.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
Okay, anyone else?
So we do have another question. Cheryl, could you provide a listing of these pieces and what gallery they are in? So I don't know if you have a listing or not, but if you do have something you could share, I could send that to the participants if you would like.
Okay, most of these pieces are not on display at the moment. Nothing from the prints and drawings room is on display. And a lot of the decorative arts are not on display. None of the tapestries or the embroideries, those are not on display. Those you can also request to see through the textile galleries. But they're, so that's actually, I think, one of the good parts about Zoom is that, we're able to pull a lot of pieces from the museum that we would not normally get to see if we were just walking through the galleries. I can tell you, I don't know the numbers of the galleries. I can tell you which ones are out that I know of. If you'd like me to do that, I can try and find out the gallery numbers for the ones that are on display. If you'd like me to do that, I can do that for you.
We can, well, whatever you can pull together and whatever you feel comfortable pulling together, you can send me that and I can forward it to the participants, and think any information would be helpful. And then, maybe once, if they had a list of what is actually available to see, they could, maybe find out once they get there what gallery it might be in.
Right. I'll be glad to do that. I'll have to. I'm not exactly sure how I can find the gallery numbers, but I'll find out. I'll figure it out. Yeah, I'll be glad to do that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Dale.
With it-
Marcia has, it's interesting that the older paintings painted the Jewish subjects in European dress and how that affects our perceptions of those stories.
It is. Well, how do you think how does it affect your perception?
It was
Whoever.
Marcia. Marcia, do you want
Marcia?
to share how it affects your perception? I think
I know.
she might have left.
There.
Yeah, she might have left.
I think the whole. What she said, she's thinking.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think what it does is that it makes us feel more comfortable with the images. It made the people that were looking at them feel more comfortable. They felt there was an accessibility. It wasn't that they were kings and queens that were, it was something that they were familiar with. And that familiarity, I think, was more comfortable. And that's why I think they did it at that point. And it just, almost all of these paintings, they were portrayed in contemporary clothing.
Do we have other questions? Not seeing any other questions.
Well, then it falls to me to thank you again for a wonderful, inspiring, informative presentation. And I know I join with everyone who's on the Zoom in telling you that we're looking forward to your upcoming presentations. And thank you again for all the work and all the preparation that you do to make these so informative and so special for all of us.
Oh, well, thank you, Stephen. It was fun.
Yay!
I can't
Thank you,
believe that
Dale.
the only thing I mispronounced was a contemporary name. I'm really surprised.
You did great, and it was so enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Well,
I
thank you.
think the only thing that excels this is a personal tour with Dale as your docent. That adds special magic.
Hi, Howard. How are you feeling?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Good,
Great.
good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see everyone next month.
Okay.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.